I get excited before coming into satsang um, because I realize that it's an opportunity to describe life as seen from a different perspective. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how to deliver the concept in ways that might allow them to penetrate, to land, in order for an aha to um, to happen. And I also know that no matter how hard we try, the outcome really completely out of our control. So, it can have the best of intention. I want to do my best. I'm always interested to hear what actually ends up coming out of my mouth, because I've learned a long time ago that if you try to plan it in a way that is more than just thinking about a theme, it really falls flat. So I'm always amazed at what actually comes out. And I'm excited because I know that at any moment there could be a very significant aha just because of one little thing that's said. So I get excited before coming into satsang. I also have started to appreciate a little more, seeing that there's regular people in quantity watching day after day after day. That this really is, in a way, the same as what I felt as a seeker when I went to visit Ramesh, and sometimes I was in Mumbai for 4 or 5 weeks, and every single day without fail I would turn up at 9 in the morning, excited to be there. So now I'm on the other side of the fence, in a manner of speak, excited, and can appreciate that maybe for those listening, even though until this really dawned on me, I thought, how come people keep coming back and listening time and time again? And then, I remembered this being the case for me in Mumbai. I'd look forward to going to sleep because I knew that tomorrow would come quickly once I'm asleep. And then when I'd wake up, I was looking forward for the time between waking up and 9 o'clock when the satsang would start. I'd be excited about the time passing quickly. And without fail, every day, listening to Ramesh, it never felt old. And with the benefit of hindsight, I am able to see how the seeds, the information, such important information as far as the contemplating, the thinking, the adjusting of the concept, so that essentially my understanding, my way of seeing life, was more and more in line with what the concepts say. And I have to be completely frank, is that I still look at the whole framework and think, what an amazing description, what a robust framework for life. And what I get excited about is putting forward the framework in a way that hopefully it does sink in to a level that you guys start seeing that these sub-concepts within the teaching really are adequate at describing life. Now, that doesn't mean anything more than a description of life, but as a description, we go, wow, that is a good description. And they all come together to essentially, in my experience, allow us to see all of the different ways life happens, including the craziness that happens from time to time in life, in our own life, sort of exclusively in our life. Sometimes crazy stuff is happening, and then at other times, sort of bigger hysteria and craziness happening. And so I guess at the moment, we could say that very much is what's going on in the world. There's so many convergences happening, and if I didn't have this changed perspective, then I can understand that what's happening would be so confusing. Like I would need to find my way of digesting it and processing it as best as I could, and I know that if my way was different, it would be very challenging and confusing the way that I would come to digest it without some of these ways of seeing why these things are happening. If I had a different framework, it means we always end up sort of reconciling what is happening with our framework. And the problem is that what it will then create is the gap between what really is happening and how we process it is filled essentially by an uncomfortableness. That's what tends to happen. And if we see it in line with what is really happening and can explain it, can feel it as is described in wisdom teachings about life, then that gap gets smaller and smaller and smaller until there's no gap. So if we are seeing it like the wisdom teachings describe, there's no gap. And the closer we get to seeing it that way, the smaller and smaller the gap is. And that gap is a gap of uncomfortableness, a gap of fear, you could say. So life is always circumstance. That is another way of saying life, circumstance, events. So one of the Buddha's sayings that Ramesh used to like to put out there, because it's so much in line with the teaching, is events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. So events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen. So events is sort of bigger, broader something happening. Let's say a thunderstorm. So that is the event, a thunderstorm. And a tree falls, and then someone or a group of people move the tree. So that is a deed. Deed gets done because of the circumstance. The broader circumstance is the event. The broader event, you could say, is life, in which all the sub-events happen. So events happen, deeds are done. So people move the tree off the car, for example. And consequences happen. So there will be a consequence to moving the tree off the car. Let's say you move it off the car and it ends up falling and breaking one of the people's foot. That was a consequence of the deed. And so life always has consequences. There's always cause and effect. Action and consequence. So that's life, circumstance. And circumstance, relative to the individual experiencing the circumstance, is either going to be pleasurable or painful. And as we've spoken about in some of the questions, that's just a simple way of saying that circumstance is either pleasurable or painful. There could be a mix of pleasure and pain in a particular circumstance. You might be standing outside in the sun and it's very hot, and so that might be painful. And you might be listening to a great concert of a music group that you like while sitting in the sun, and the music and the atmosphere is pleasurable. So the circumstance is a mix of pleasure and pain. Isn't that an amazing way of understanding life? That in itself is a huge general, simple description of life. Life is an unfolding, a movement of circumstance. And circumstance, whatever it happens to be, is experienced by the human being that is part of the circumstance. And to the human being, that circumstance which is experienced, which they are part of, is either pleasurable or painful. That circumstance is, from the perspective of the human being, what was destined to happen. That is an attitude we can have towards the circumstance, that what unfolds is what was destined to unfold. So we can look at it and say, life circumstance is all an unfolding according to God's will. And God's will includes and requires the movement and the participation of the individual in the circumstance. So whatever I do in a moment, whatever way that I perform, whichever way that I function in a moment, whatever my reaction or my response is part of the unfolding circumstance, part of life, part of what is predetermined to unfold. And that too is going to be part of the pleasure or pain of life, and part of what will have a consequence. And the consequence will be part of the pleasure or pain of life. The consequence will effectively be the circumstance in that moment. And the consequence, which is the circumstance in that moment, is related to what came before. So that means that if you go to work and you get a promotion, you get told, can you please come into the manager's office? And they say, look, we'd like to offer you this promotion. You've done great work. That is an event, or part of an event, part of the circumstance in life. It is part of God's will unfolding, part of what is predetermined unfolding. And to the human being that is part of the circumstance, let's assume in most cases, if you've been told you've done a great job and you've got a promotion, that's going to be pleasurable circumstance. And so the human being has to experience the pleasure. Or let's say you get asked to go into the manager's office and they say, look, we're very sorry, but given the current economic climate, we're going to have to make you redundant. And this week is going to be your last week. So there is going to be a painful situation there. Let's say financial pain, sadness because you enjoy your job, you like the people you work with. And that too is part of the unfolding story of life. God's will unfolding. So why do I say God's will? Really, you can change the word God for any other word that you like. Source, consciousness, life, energy, totality. There's something about God. It's very loaded for a lot of people, and so it can cause a problem. But as we start to feel part of this unfolding of life, it intuitively feels okay and, in fact, appropriate to refer to God's will. I'm not sure why. It's not appropriate. What I'm saying is, I'm not saying we should refer to God's will and have a specific idea of a God. That is not what comes with the understanding. I think if we have an idea of God that is inspired by our past conditioning, that probably feels comforting, maybe, rather than what I'm calling right. It's an intuitive sense that feels appropriate to refer to God's will. But when I think about God, I don't think about someone or something controlling me, separate from me, outside looking in. That's an idea of God that is much more aligned with conditioning from society that have reasons for referring to that sort of God. What we do know is that there is all of this, which when we look at it is quite amazing in its detail, in its creativity. There's all of life. Nature has amazing complexity to it. The human instrument is amazingly complex. As we understand how our brains work and how the biological intelligence of the immune system works, and how the body manages to keep everything in a state of equilibrium and homeostasis. How we learn and absorb information, how the brain is so adaptable to change and working around malfunctions in the system, especially malfunctions in the brain and the organs that is part of the human instrument. As we start to see how all of this works, we really can't help but be in awe with life. And so it seems to me, it feels very appropriate to look at this and feel like it has come from a source. And to feel connected to that source, and to feel grateful for life. Not really as an idea, but as an arising, gratitude arising. Not as a thought, oh, I should be grateful to life, but as part of the awe, as part of the recognition of being alive, which I suggest is one of the capacities of the human intellect, because of its complexity, to contemplate its own existence, to be able to recognize its existence in a world of time and space in a way that I don't believe that beings, animals with less complex intellects are able to do. Very clearly we see animals are able to function in a fairly advanced way, but this capacity to contemplate our own existence and appreciate the fact I exist. I don't think that a dog or a cat actually says, wow, what is all of this? Who am I? Isn't it amazing that I am here amongst all of this? Where did I come from? Where did all this come from? And when I talk about a contemplation of our own existence, it's not just questions. The questions are, in a way, the beginning of the contemplation of our own existence. And the culmination of the contemplation of our own existence is the appreciation, the direct knowing I exist amongst all of this, as part of all of this, one with all of this. My existence, which includes my awareness, is what brings all of this into existence. At least I can say that very confidently, brings it all into existence, at least from the perspective of my experience of it. It may exist independent of my consciousness and my awareness of it, but within my specific experience of it, my knowing of the lamp, of the tree, of the other person, that specific experience only exists because of the consciousness that is what I am. It is my existence. So I think human beings are unique instruments that have been placed in this manifestation by Source in order for life to be known from the perspective of the human being. Now, obviously, the animals are there, and we can say are just as important because they are part of the whole, and so Source is knowing life through that vehicle also. But in the case of the human being, there is this capacity to know the life experience with extra depth. So this is our birthright. And in practical terms, the difference, the transformation, the movement that we call spiritual seeking, in practical terms, what it can deliver is a change in the way life is known, in a change in the way that we feel ourselves in relation to life, in relation to the others, such that the uncomfortableness falls away. That doesn't mean the pleasure or pain of circumstance, the pleasure or pain of our own biological movements stops. It doesn't mean that sadness or anger, excitement and joy stop. They continue, they're part of the biological pleasure and pain of life, part of the duality of life, part of the interconnected opposite, part of the polarity that has to exist in order for this manifestation to be the manifestation it is. It is a manifestation of interconnected opposites, of health and disease, wealth and poverty, big and small, good and bad, pleasure and pain. But what can fall away is our sense of self, the sense of self that feels threatened and challenged and uncomfortable with being alive. And that sense of self that, when it exists, the sense of self that feels uncomfortable, it often experiences itself with the inclusion of guilt and shame, blame and hatred, worry and anxiety, pride and arrogance. Let's keep them together. We'll do the doership half. So guilt and shame, blame and hatred, pride and arrogance. They are the more obvious doership components, and the attachment to outcome are the worry and anxiety, expectation, and attachment to outcomes. And when that movement is happening in the human being, we can say the psychological me is present and active. And we can see it being active in different intensities. So there are certain times when the psychological me is particularly active and it's particularly uncomfortable. Well, what we might not have realized is that that psychological me, when it's in place, tends to be active all of the time. It's just that some of the time the activeness is what we might consider normal and what we might have normalized, where we don't feel it as an overt uncomfortableness. It's sort of what we have assumed is the baseline uncomfortableness of life, of being human in life. And then there are these peaks of uncomfortableness that arise, often in relation to circumstance, something that's happened. And then there are also these arisings of uncomfortableness in relation to a sort of persistent feeling of anxiety that might arise without any particular circumstance invoking it. Just the general circumstance is pervaded with a feeling of anxiety, or a sense of hopelessness can be there from time to time for no reason. It just comes in. So that psychological me tends to essentially be uncomfortableness. And so in this teaching, it's saying we can be a human being with or without that psychological me, what is referred to in this framework as the doer, the belief of personal doership and the belief of attachment to outcome. And that psychological me is very busy in life, thinking, because the psychological me is essentially a thought movement that in its intense form arises and is felt as a feeling. Essentially, all feeling and thought of the suffering sort, the thinking mind, feeling and thought, is a psychological, a thought-based movement. And it includes the me that didn't do things right, the me that someone did this to, the me that is facing this future, the me that is being attacked by the present circumstance. So that me is very busy all the time, judging, commenting, feeling like a victim, worrying about the future, regretting the past, complaining in the present moment. It just doesn't stop. It doesn't, as long as life is there, it sort of has a job to do. It sees the other as an enemy and a competitor and a rival. And in any moment, a friend can turn into an enemy if they act a certain way. That is the experience of the psychological me, because the psychological me believes that its completeness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. It means its completeness is dependent on it controlling life, because it also believes it is what is responsible for pleasure, 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 and the other is responsible for the pleasure or pain they deliver. So to whatever extent it will try and control the other, it's always trying to control itself. Generally speaking, we can say it's trying to control life, because it believes that that is actually a task it is responsible for, that it needs to do, because it feels, it knows itself as something dependent on outcomes, something that is defined, something that is added to by pleasurable and positive outcomes, something that is attacked or reduced or diminished by negative outcomes, by pain. So when a friend lets you down, that is felt as a personal attack, a diminishment of who I am because of how the other has acted. And so that psychological self is always busy. And if that aspect of the human being, that part of the machinery, what we can call the thinking mind, if that gets dismantled, gets weakened, if the screws that hold it together start to get undone and it starts to wobble and shake, and then panels start falling off and it starts collapsing, when it is sufficiently dismantled, it ceases to exist, essentially. It ceases to be a part of the machinery that can produce certain outputs. And that essentially is what the spiritual journey is doing. It's undoing the screws, it's shaking, it's grinding bits of the psychological self down. And who put this thing, this part of the human apparatus? Who created it? If you ask that part of the apparatus, it would say, well, I created myself. So I better feel bad about having created myself, given you've just described me as being so troublesome. That would be it functioning in its form that it's very good of, is not feeling good enough. Shame, feeling guilty, feeling like it is responsible for how life unfolds, how the experience of life is in each moment. The real reason it's there is because it's destiny, because it's part of how life is designed to be unfolding. We could say that it's the default way that humans turn up in life as a result of the evolution of life or the creation of life. So we can describe life both causally and metaphysically, because it's both. When I hear about these arguments between creationists and evolutionists, it makes me laugh. But it's completely understandable, because the human intellect wants to take sides, wants to find a position on a spectrum and place itself there. And one interpretation of the middle path that Buddhism puts forward, the dualistic interpretation of the middle path is, it's very simple. We have a spectrum, stick yourself in the middle. That's the middle path. Don't overdo the left and don't overdo the right. And that's exactly what the human intellect, as it's been conditioned to see life in a very linear and one-sided way, tends to do. So to me, the middle path has got nothing to do with pitting oneself in the center, but rather stepping off the spectrum and seeing the spectrum as being exactly that, seeing a spectrum of life as being interconnected opposites, and not taking a position on the spectrum. So in its most crude interpretation, the middle path is don't overindulge, don't have too much of something. And then it's okay for you to have, 1 or 2 drinks is okay, but don't have 10. That's the middle path. And you don't need to go and have, I'm on the no drinks side. So, that's not what I see as the middle path. The middle path is step off and see that the spectrum includes 40 drinks and no drinks and anything in between. And that a person at any point is going to land somewhere on the spectrum. And that there is a spectrum for all aspects of life in each moment. Helpful or unhelpful, kind, unkind. Polite, rude. Big, small, strong, weak, healthy, unhealthy, thoughtful, not thoughtful. And so the middle path to me is stepping off the spectrum and seeing the spectrum and understanding that we will find ourselves anywhere on that spectrum at any point in time, depending on our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And that the other is on the spectrum of pleasure or pain, on the spectrum of circumstance and functioning a certain way, based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning, based on God's will, based on the creation. So that to me is the middle path. And as I said, that's very different to what our thinking mind wants to do, which is says, I want to have my spot on the spectrum. That's it. And then I'll put my flag in the ground, and anything that is not where I am is wrong, is not acceptable. That's separation. That is resistance. It's like, oh, I'm in the middle path. I have 2 or 3 drinks. These people have none. They're not enjoying life. They're teetotalers and they don't know what they're doing. And look at this hooligan over here. 10 drinks. He's wrong. The middle path is to step off and see that I could be the hooligan, I could be the teetotaler, I could be the one that wants to have 1 or 2 drinks. Simultaneously, when stepping off, I will be biologically somewhere on the spectrum, but my attitude is I just happen to be somewhere on the spectrum, and someone else is going to be somewhere else on the spectrum. And that is an attitude of acceptance, an attitude of seeing the whole without of being attached or without craving or averting one part of the spectrum from being part of the whole. And simultaneously finding that we have to be somewhere on the spectrum biologically. That's what the spectrum of interconnected opposites is. And the human being biologically will have a certain height. And that is, for example, where they are on the height spectrum. And the fact that there are people that are much taller and much shorter is, from the middle path point of view, it's of course. That's the whole, that range. So going back to the, choosing between creationism and evolutionism, evolution and creation, I see that the two can be interconnected, complementaries. That life can be seen as a creation, and it's a creation that unfolds according to causality, or is a creation of evolution. So we don't need to say that it is a creation and not an evolution, or it is an evolution and not a creation. They can quite comfortably coexist. So this attitude, this personal, psychological me can dissolve. But how does it dissolve, and why is it there in the first place? Well, the concept in the framework is that it is there because it is part of the evolution of the human race. So humanity has evolved in such a way that when humans come into existence, this psychological me seems to develop. So life has put it in place. Our experience of life, the experience that includes the presence of the psychological me and the guilt and the blame and the pride and the worry and the anxiety, is exactly as it's meant to be. I'm not saying that it's pleasurable or painful, that it's comfortable or uncomfortable or peaceful. It is what it is, which means life as it is in this moment will be pleasurable or painful or a mix, and there is going to be uncomfortableness or peace. It is exactly as it's meant to be, which means it is as it has been created. So having this explanation that life is circumstance, in each moment the unfolding circumstance is life. And if you remember a circumstance in the past, you can look back and go, that was life. And it played out exactly as it was destined, exactly as it was created. And this moment is playing out exactly as destined, all the way down to the smallest of details, how a leaf falls off a tree and what path it takes to get to the ground, is all happening exactly as it's destined to happen. Both from the creation point of view and the causal point of view. So the creation point of view tends to focus more on and include more of the spontaneous explanation of life, the non-causal, the non-linear, the absence of time. All there is the present. The evolution aspect of life is where the present moment is seen as a movement of time and space and form and causality. A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. That's the evolution perspective. And the creation perspective is that A, B, C, and D all exist simultaneously, are part of the whole, and A leads, and when you put the two together, creation and evolution, you have A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, and D leads to C, leads to B, leads to A, which really means that life is a creation of causality. You can't pick one side and say that is true and the other is not true. They are both equally as true and untrue as each other. They coexist. So this is a description of how we can come to see life. Not life as a theoretical imagination of what might happen, but what's happening for you right now. So the hope is that the descriptions just serve as pointers for your attention to land on your own daily life experience as it happens, for you to get to your car and realize you locked the keys in the car. That's circumstance. So you're looking through the window and you see them dangling there in the starter slot. Oh, keys are in the car. Circumstance, pain in the moment. And so you get your phone out to call roadside assistance, or to call one of your family members to bring you the spare keys or roadside, and the phone dies out of battery. Circumstance. More pain in the moment. So if that happens and we start to see, this is life, this is circumstance, and circumstance is pleasure or pain. Now the concepts are bringing you in direct contact with life in such a way that it can be known as it's being described. And that's useful, because once we're here, once we're connected to what is being described, more and more of the nuances that are so important for us to come to understand, because they start to undo the psychological interpretation of life, which is basically an interpretation of life that has been put together based on a fairly cursory exploration of the dynamics that are actually at play, which basically means an overlooking of the actual dynamics and a forming of an idea about life based on how the human tends to form its idea about itself and life. So one of the ideas is that, this circumstance shouldn't be happening. Whose fault is it? It's happened, it shouldn't be happening, so now I need to find out whose fault it is. And it's either my fault, usually, or the others, or God. If we can't find someone to fault, we'll fault God. And so that becomes a psychological way of interpreting the circumstance, and it's what we can call our attitude to the circumstance. The circumstance is the keys are in the car. That's the circumstance. The fact that that is painful to the biological preferences, which are part of the creation. So the human being is there and it has its preferences. And its preference is probably usually not to see the cars dangling in the key slot when the door is closed and you're outside. That's going to create a situation which is probably going to lead to missing an appointment, or spending time during the day doing an activity that you would probably not choose to do, like wait outside the car in the cold or in the heat until the situation can be fixed. It might mean having to pay $50 to get the roadside assistance people to help you, which is financial pain. That's the circumstance. That's the pleasure or pain of the unfolding situation, which with the right attitude we can say is exactly as it's meant to be, God's will, and laugh at it. You God. And understand these things happen. This is not the universe malfunctioning. This is the universe functioning. Explanation from the causal side of things is this happened according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So what that means is your genes and up-to-date conditioning. Let's say you're forgetful. Let's say you're easily distracted. That's part of your makeup. It's how you function. And you find that you get out, pull up in the parking lot. You check the mirror to see that everything's in place. You pick up your sunglasses and your wallet that's on the driver's seat and check something in the back, get out, close the door, and realize you left the keys in the car. And you do this regularly. So it's part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So life has included you with that specific genes and up-to-date conditioning in order for that circumstance to happen. How could the circumstance happen if you were had genes and up-to-date conditioning that were always attentive? It would mean that you wouldn't forget your keys in the car, which means life mightn't turn out exactly the way as it's intended. Now, the explanation would be if you didn't forget your keys, then it was destined for your keys to remain on your person and not in the car. And that would be a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So whatever happens is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and it's God's will unfolding as exactly as it's destined, according to God's will or cosmic law. The cosmic law is the way of looking at it that tends to be more specific. If you just say God's will, which is fine if you can understand, everything's happening according to God's will, or cosmic law, like the limb of the tree falls because termites got in there and they ate the tree. It was weak, and then the force of gravity snaps the limb off. And so that happened exactly as destined according to the cosmic laws. That forced the ants, the termites, to eat that sort of wood because of the way that they were made up and where they built their nest, and that piece of wood was in their path. And then the other cosmic laws, once the termites had weakened the wood by eating all of the sugars out of the wood, which is what the termites like, the structure is then weakened and gravity does the rest. So the limb fell according to the cosmic laws, which is the causal, the evolution way of seeing it. And we can see that it happened because of everything that came before, including the evolution of trees and the evolution of ants or termites, from single-celled organisms to more complex organisms. It happened because a seed was dropped in that place and the sun was able to shine in that patch of water and fertilizer, and everything supported that tree growing, and supported the colony of ants, and supported the ants and the tree coming together, and supported the whole event happening exactly as it happened. And the path at which the limb falls to the ground is exactly as destined because of the cosmic laws that force it to fall only one way. And you could say that the cosmic laws were put in place by creation, by source. And so we can say everything happens according to God's will or cosmic laws. In fact, the two, it's not either or, they are the two sides of the coin. And so our emotions are part of the cosmic law. We wouldn't feel emotions if life hadn't evolved humans to be emotional beings. If we had no consciousness, the emotion might be there, but nothing would be there to recognize it. It's unlikely that the emotion would be there because there'd be no awareness of a situation to be emotional about, because there's no consciousness. So it's all happening because of the design of life, and specifically the design of the humans, which are part of the design of life. So if your kids are shouting and carrying on, you can say, this is God's will. It's God's will for me to be experiencing pain in the moment, in this moment. And if you explode at the kids, then that's God's will. It's their destiny to receive the consequence of their fighting. Pain in the moment for them. No dessert, you're grounded. They might not look at it as God's will, and so they might hate you. You might not look at it as God's will, and you could hate them. So as we start to see that the laboratory is our own life experience, that's where the understanding starts going deeper and deeper, when we start to see for ourselves the descriptions, which are just pointers, and we start to see the mechanisms, the dynamics that are being pointed at in the concept, through the concept, we start seeing them in play. So that circumstance is unfolding in each moment exactly as it's destined to unfold according to God's will. Sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain, relative to the human being and its biological preferences, which are also part of the moment, part of the creation. And then there's this psychological me that when it's in place, the psychological identity, the doer, the me, that when that's in place has to take life personally, because it doesn't see life as I'm describing it. It sees life as what it should be. That's what it has, its image of how life should be, how the other should act, how I should act. And then when it's different, when it turns out differently in each moment, which it's bound to because there's so many moving parts, then life is seen to be out of whack. So there's no alignment, no harmony with life. There's resistance to what is, because we have our version of what should be. And that's the role of the psychological me. It's forced to experience life like that. And life put that in place. And we can say that that psychological me is also there because of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the genes and up-to-date conditioning control both the psychological me, the doer, and the biological components of the person, the forgetfulness, the inattentiveness, the preference for warm weather over cold weather. All of that is based on one's genes and up-to-date conditioning. And what is the conditioning that specifically determines the psychological me? This is very important to know because life puts it in place and life undoes it. And one of the ways it undoes it is by putting forward a pointer, which is part of the new conditioning that a human can receive in each moment, because life is always delivering new conditioning. And the pointer is saying that the base of the psychological me, the conditioning at the base of the psychological me, the belief at the base of the psychological me, because the psychological me is essentially a belief identity, is I am the human being. That part I agree with. I am largely or only a physical entity, already going off track. I am the doer that is in control of how I think, how I feel, how I function. And I'm responsible for my life looking a certain way, and I'm responsible for the consequences and the outcomes. Completely off track, but that's the belief. The other is the doer in control of their life and how they think and feel, and they should act in a way that is going to deliver pleasure, pleasure, pleasure to me, because that's what completes me. Another fallacy about who we are, and yet it's in place. And so that essentially is the belief structure that then shoots off into many, many subsets of my happiness is to be found in pleasure. So we then have this belief structure that feels defined by its relationships with all of the different people it comes across in the day, feels defined by all of its functioning and its successes and its failures, etc. But in general terms, it's I am the doer, and my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And the ultimate pleasure it's looking for is love. Love from the other. It believes that when it gets love from the other, it will finally be complete. And the reason that's there is because the way life develops the human being is that there is an innate sense of lack, and that sense of lack is there because of the sense I'm not good enough to be loved. And so the mission becomes a mission of getting the love that will confirm I'm good enough. I have been reformed. I have self-improved sufficiently that I am now lovable. I am a perfect human being, and all will be well. So the mission in life is a mission of receiving feedback that can effectively correct or fill in the gap or the hole that says I'm not good enough. That becomes the mission. And in fact, that feeling of lack is not there because we actually are lacking anything. It's there because the false idea of ourself inherently has to feel inadequate. It is inadequate, it's not who we are. And the solution is not to become a perfect person. The solution is for the sense of lack that is driving us to think we need to become a perfect person, is for that to fall away. And then once that falls away, being different becomes irrelevant. It's like, oh, why do I need to be different? Why do I need to be successful or live according to society's expectation or be any different from how I am? Why do I have to not live according to society's expectations if we find ourselves being pretty much the model citizen? If we don't have any sense of lack, we don't have a feeling that I need to be different. And so the solution is not to become a specific type of person that fits a certain mold, but rather for this idea of there being a problem, which is a feeling, for that sense of lack to fall away. And then the motivator that is motivating us to be different and for us to, for life to be different, that falls away. And then we find ourselves at peace with life, at peace with ourselves, at peace with the other. We find, oh, I don't need you to be different. Sure, it would be great if you didn't play your music at 4 a.m. That wakes me up. That's pain in the moment. But to the extent that you don't change, there isn't a sense that says, if you don't change, I am incomplete. Whereas when the incompleteness is there, then when someone is playing music at 4 a.m, automatically it's assumed that I feel I'm incomplete because of the music being played at 4 a.m. So with this belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome in place, we're forced to have these feelings of uncomfortableness that add an extra layer, a very heavy, dense layer on top of the inevitable pleasure or pain of the circumstance in life. And those feelings are part of the creation, part of the part of life. We won't say that they are part of circumstance. We say they are our attitude to circumstance. And when you put circumstance and your attitude to circumstance, that's life overall. So the combination of circumstance and your attitude to circumstance is life. The circumstance we can just call the flow of life. So flow of life means circumstance. Life overall is the flow of life, the circumstance, and your attitude to the flow of life. And the uncomfortableness, the guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, which are all attitudes to the flow of life, are feelings that arise. An uncomfortable feeling. And when it arises, if we can see that as part of the creation, then we can be pretty impressed at how life is bringing about change in us. It's like, even this arising, this uncomfortableness, this response of blaming the other because I see them as the doer, this response of feeling absolutely inadequate because I've locked the keys in the car. That too is part of the overall experience of life, part of God's will, part of the arising in the moment because of God's will or cosmic law. If that happens, a shift back, a step backwards has happened. A witnessing of life as a happening has happened. Admittedly, if that, what we can call the primary suffering of shame for having locked one's keys in the car, if that shame is there, we have to admit that there is a primary suffering, which means involvement in the circumstance as my doing, right? So involvement in the circumstance has happened. And there is the pain of the circumstance and the shame. However, if that shame is known to be part of life, a very significant shift has happened. Because in seeing it as part of life, essentially what has happened, without it being a mental, I'll describe it as a thought, but it's not really a thought. What has happened is the stopping of involvement in saying, that's life. There's a silence inside. A silence towards the shame. It's a shame that there isn't a silence towards the pain of the keys being in the car, because that's the primary involvement. But to be quiet with the shame is amazing. And that's what it is. It's a silence in relation to the shame. It's a non-involvement. It's neither aversion or grasping. And we're not saying to love the shame in a way where we say, let me, and be involved in it in a loving way. And it's not like an aversion of the shame where you're pushing it away. It's a silence. Which is really, I know there's nothing for me as the doer to do about the shame. It's a happening. And as that attitude penetrates and becomes more and more stabilized in how it sees life, then at some point we might find that the attitude is an attitude of silence towards the keys being found to be hanging in the car when the door's locked. And there's a silence to that. There can be the pain of, oh, that's going to cost me. I'm going to be late. Well, so there's the pain of that, but it doesn't carry on and turn into an uncomfortableness. So then there's a silence towards the circumstance, a non-involvement from an attitude point of view. The biological movement in the moment makes sense because there is the human being is part of the circumstance, and so the biological part, you might hit your head. Oh, even again, that can be part of the biological movement, and then it doesn't turn into a psychological story about who I am. And so all of these things can be seen. So if the shame arises because of the circumstance, that's an opportunity to see, look, suffering arising, and uncomfortableness with myself because of circumstance. And if you find that uncomfortableness there when you wake up in the morning, let's say, and you feel this is just a standard experience when you wake up in the morning, and say, yes, it's an uncomfortableness with oneself. And if you go in and you find it's based on a sense of shame, you might even go in, you might find it's to do with the way you treated your friends in your history, in your past, or the way you feel about yourself because of your work achievements or lack of them. And so it's there when you wake up, and that's the opportunity to see it for what it is. Oh, an uncomfortableness with myself, because I believe I'm the doer of the outcomes in the past. And that doesn't mean, I shouldn't believe I'm the doer. That's just you're describing what this feeling is. Uncomfortableness, suffering in the moment, based on the deeply ingrained belief of attachment to outcome. My successes should have been greater, and I am the doer of those failures. I could have and should have done them differently. So we are not the doers. Life is a happening. That's the core of the teaching. Everything's a happening according to God's will. If we can come to start to see life this way, amazing things can happen. If we see that my thoughts arise because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, my feelings, my emotions, both the biological feelings and emotions, the biological feeling of hunger, the biological feeling of tiredness, the biological feeling of needing to go to the toilet, their biological feelings, and the emotion of anger, the emotion of sadness, and the psychological suffering, the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry, and that, which is always an attitude to the circumstance. If we can start to see that all of that happens entirely because of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, meaning we're a very complex biological robot, a biological instrument created by life in order for the life experience to be able to arise the way it does through this particular body-mind organism, through human beings. So saying that we're a biological robot isn't reducing us down to a bunch of metal, which is what we imagine, a robot to be. We're saying, no, this is not reducing it down. This is saying the human being is a very complex biological instrument, a beautiful biological instrument capable of feeling love and emotions and anger and sadness. So it's just putting those different feelings and movements and expressions into context and saying that's a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. If you have manic thoughts, it's a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. No doer there, just the functioning of your specific design. And so as this is seen, and we see it over and over in our own daily life, we have a thought about, oh, that person is so irresponsible, for example, and we catch the thought arising and might say, okay, that's judgment. Or it might not be judgment, it might just be discernment. It depends on how it feels, whether it's a judgment that the person is invalid for being that way, or whether it's just a discernment that says actually what he's doing is dangerous and it's irresponsible. However, I see that in the context of life, he's functioning according to his genes and up-to-date conditioning. So it depends on how it is. Whatever it is, it's a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And at some point, we have this insight. I simply cannot be the doer. There is no doer. There never has been a doer. There has always been the operating of a complex biological instrument, and all the other human beings are complex biological instruments. There simply cannot be a doer. There is no doer. There never has been a doer. We realize, there's been a belief, an attitude of personal doership, which means an interpretation that the functioning of a complex biological instrument is actually the doing of a me. Though this me is a insertion into the picture. It's let me just stick this me in there as the driver of the bus, as the controller of the mechanism. And in fact, we find there's just a mechanism that doesn't need a controller. And so the psychological me can collapse in an instant. I simply cannot be the doer. These words are happening according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning. I'm not speaking Japanese for a very good reason, because life didn't deliver new conditioning moment after moment in such a way that this body-mind organism can speak Japanese, but I'm speaking English for a very good reason. I'm speaking the concepts of non-duality in the way that Ramesh put forward, because there I was day after day listening to the concepts being put forward, which was new conditioning in my life, which became part of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. I simply cannot be the doer. Life is a happening. That doesn't mean in each moment you won't function. So this doesn't mean sit on the couch, because what's the point? Everything is predetermined. What's the point? That's a thought of the doer that says, if everything's predetermined, I can't claim responsibility for my actions. So what's the point of doing anything if I can't claim responsibility? The doer wants to be able to claim responsibility for those perfect actions that people will love me for. So when the doer hears everything is predetermined, says, what's the point of life then? And we just need to reframe it. Go, that's because your priority is getting pleasure from your actions. So then you say, if I'm not the doer, there's no point. What about if we say, the purpose of life is to experience life? Then whether it's predetermined or not predetermined is irrelevant, because you know that there is experience in each moment. And seeing life as predetermined isn't going to change the experience. It's going to change the attitude to the circumstance. But, when you get to have an ice cream on a hot day, and it's the best flavored ice cream you've ever had, whether it's predetermined or not is irrelevant to the pleasure of the ice cream interacting with the taste buds. And so then you can fully appreciate, close your eyes, and all there is taste. And then it's like, thank you, God. Thank you, life, for this pleasure. Knowing it's not just thank you for the pleasure, this is all I ever needed was the pleasure, but more in being able to experience just that amazing pleasure for the sake of the experience. You also know what is it that is aware of the pleasure? Oh, I am. So really when we say thank you God, we're not really saying thank you God for the pleasure, but rather thank you for the existence. And the thought, thank you God, is not necessarily the same dualistic thank you God that someone might project onto when I say, oh, I'm thank you God. They say, well, I thought you were meant to be a proponent of non-duality, so who is the one thanking God? Because that sounds like two. And that is sort of one of the non-dual platitudes that is overlooking the fact that life is a creation of causality, that life is a non-dual duality, that life is a oneness that includes many on the level of daily life experience. Life is a duality of interconnected opposites. Life is an experience of many human beings. But with the right attitude, we can understand that I am an instrument through which consciousness is functioning. The other is an instrument through which consciousness is functioning. And everyone is being moved by life, being lived by life, by God's will or cosmic law, to always be in exactly the place that they are destined to be in the place and to be functioning in the way that is inevitable. And that the consequences that follow are inevitable because they are governed by the cosmic laws that prevent the tree limb from falling upwards. The cosmic laws make it inevitable that the tree limb is going to fall to the ground. So, I'm excited. I hope that in today's satsang, someone started off feeling excited and maybe had an aha moment, which is really just new conditioning coming in and becoming part of the up-to-date conditioning. Ramesh used to say that new conditioning can change our up-to-date conditioning, and sometimes it can change our up-to-date conditioning radically. What he was talking about is the radical change where we shift from seeing ourself as the doer and the other as the doer, seeing life as this unfold, or not as an unfolding, seeing life as something that we and the other are controlling, rather than seeing this bigger picture view of life as a happening, unfolding exactly as it's destined to happen. So we'll take some questions. Hi, Mona.
Hello.
Hello, I can hear you.
Hello, everyone. My question was the different stages that I think there is in knowing what you are talking about, being aware that we are up-to-date genes and conditioning. For my part, I was first I was one, experiencing an object. I and the experience were one, and then I was aware that I was not a body, and later that I was not a mind. So I am aware of a world, a body, a mind, and then I am aware that I am aware, and I am aware that I am aware, meaning knowing. And my question is, how come that sometimes I am aware of a wrong statement, that is not truth in absolute, I'm trying to give an example. 5 plus 5 equals 11. I am aware that 5 plus 5 equals 11. And then one day, I discover that it equals 10.
Mm-hmm.
So I am aware of an object. I am awareness, but does awareness sometimes experience something else than truth?
Right. Well, the awareness doesn't have the capacity to think. Awareness doesn't do the thinking. So the 5 plus 5 equals 11 is not awareness functioning. The speaking is not awareness speaking. Awareness is aware of the speaking, is aware of the functioning of the thinking that might think 5 plus 5 is 11. Awareness is aware of that and not separate from it, meaning it can't be aware of something that is separate from the awareness, meaning the thinking must be arising within the field of awareness for awareness to be aware of it. And so often when there is a realization what I am is awareness, we also think that awareness is doing the thinking, whereas in the way that you describe it, I would suggest that when we awaken to the I am aware part, which really means awareness aware of itself, and awareness not so much as the body, but awareness as the formless awareness, aware of everything, knowing that what it's aware of, or directly experiencing what it's aware of, is not separate from it. That perspective, being grounded in that context, I would say that awareness doesn't think. It doesn't have the capacity to think. It just has the capacity to be aware of objects that are not seen as outside of itself.
So when I say truth, I am a truth seeker, or I like truth, or does it mean awareness, or does it mean true objects?
Yeah, so this is where this is where it all gets a bit tricky, because it can mean different things at different stages, and there isn't really a truth about what truth is. From one perspective, I would say there is no truth that we can come to know, actually. So one of the concepts I would say about truth is that we really aren't seekers of truth, because there is no truth that we can know. If we were seekers of truth, really, we would have to end up frustrated. And at some point, I think we come to realize that, oh, even what I thought was truth, what felt like absolute, is not actually as absolute as I thought it was. So why I say that there is no such thing as truth from one perspective, where when we're being really technical about it, is that everything is always changing, and even the awareness that we experience or know, and it feels like it's not changing. When the intellect looks at it closer and closer, it will appreciate that even what feels like unchanging awareness is not necessarily as unchanging as it can feel. And so then we go, oh, even that is not truth. Because one of the definitions of truth is that which doesn't change. And so when there's an awakening to awareness, we can't deny the sense that it feels so much less changing, so much, or even unchanging, compared to the relative objects that we were identified with before. And in that moment we go, oh, this is the truth, this is that which doesn't change, this is the absolute. All of the other stuff, all of the objects are changing and relative, and my experience is that my intellect now doesn't relate to awareness as unchanging. It is that is as changing as everything else.
When you say awareness, you mean your awareness, or you being aware that you are aware, or awareness, the formless?
The formless, so
Can we?
awareness. Go on.
Yeah. Can we say that awareness is the same place? It's formless and colorless, but sometimes it seems like your awareness is expanding. You are in the same spot of awareness, but it's the more you work on your body mind and you try to take off the distortions, the more your awareness takes, you see the scene, you see that awareness is the scene being played, the happening, and even if you forget, you automatically remember very soon that there is only awareness.
Yeah, so in the way you phrased the question, I got the impression, and I think you've confirmed it, that what you were talking about is what is often referred to as the shift of identity from knowing yourself as the body-mind organism to that which is aware of the body-mind organism. And so I was assuming you're referring to the awareness, not as it feels personal awareness of the body, but rather that which is beyond the body, and the awareness of the whole experience, which includes the experience of the body. That's how I took it. That's what you were referring to?
Yes.
Yeah.
The first stage, so yes.
Yeah. So to me, even that is actually very much a relative function that can shift, can open up into a experience that feels like it isn't a relative function, as if it shifts in such a way that it feels like it is now no longer confined to relativity, but is an absolute perspective. And so then we draw the conclusion, oh, this is the absolute, this is the formless, the unchanging, that which is ever present. And from one perspective, it is all of that, but not from, like I say, if it's from one perspective it's that, then it's not absolutely that. Because there are many other perspectives from which we see it fails to hold up to that, to those qualities.
Like it goes through, sorry.
Go on.
It feels like it, once you reach that state, your consciousness goes through stages, through states in the same day. You can feel at certain moments like awareness, being aware just of awareness, like in the deep sleep state, and then your body and your mind says we exist and you need to function through us too. And you deal with the world and you try to be in discernment. And sometimes, if you are interested in the nature of reality, you try to find truths. Mm-hmm. And that's where I was asking about how to deal with this pure knowing of something and then finding that it's not valid anymore, that there is a higher truth. Mm-hmm. It's not false, but it's always there is a higher vantage point that, yes. And it seems like the false premise is necessary to go to a higher understanding and a higher understanding and a higher understanding.
Yeah, exactly. They're like stepping stones, and each stepping stone, when you step onto it, feels like this is it. This is it, and
finally,
yeah. And inevitably, we find the process then takes us beyond that. And then we realize, that wasn't it. And once that's happened enough times, hopefully when we get to this new vantage point and we go, this is it, we go, no, this is probably just another station along the way. Now, the irony is that if we say there's higher and higher vantage points of what is more and more true, then it creates a certain impression, whereas I would say that the movement takes us back to what is much more relative. So in this teaching, we say, is it really about truth? Is that what we're seeking, truth? Are we seeking, let's say we're seeking enlightenment, we need to define what is enlightenment. So is it the seeking of truth? Is it the seeking of knowing source? So there can be all sorts of ideas or descriptions or definitions of enlightenment. In this teaching, it says, let's keep it practical, because if we keep it practical, it's harder to get lost in theory, and sometimes theory is can be, or actually concepts. Some concepts can be very fascinating, and so therefore you can get lost in it for whole lifetimes. If we keep it practical, we might find our concept is confined to what can be confirmed. So in this teaching, we say what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, when we get down to it, is to live life as the human being, but free of uncomfortableness. It's the uncomfortableness, which we can call human unhappiness, that is really driving us to seek. And if we get somewhere, if we find truth, and then truth leaves us still knowing truth, but feeling uncomfortable in life, feeling like we were before in relation to suffering, but at least I have truth, right? I've found truth. Then if that was the case, we would realize, wow, truth is really quite worthless in a sense. So we should say, why are we seeking truth? And so if we keep it really practical, we say, actually, I don't really care about truth unless truth is related to the end of suffering. And so if we say that, then we should say, well, actually, what I'm really interested in is the end of suffering. And some people haven't come to that point. They go, no, truth is important because truth is truth. You know, if I know truth, then the reward is in the fact that it is truth. I would say, well, I think you'll find that if you get truth and it doesn't change your uncomfortableness in life, you will soon offer truth to the highest bidder, because it's pointless. So that's why I say, actually, let's keep it practical, and you'll find that in practical terms, especially if we've gone through enough suffering, we will be surrendered by the suffering, and in that moment we say, who am I kidding? I'm just looking for the end of suffering. That's all. I just want to be happy in life. I'll leave the higher quests to someone else, right? If there are higher quests, Roger is very happy for someone else to go after the higher quest. Roger is more than satisfied with simple happiness for the human being. And I suggest that if a seeker does keep it practical, that's a huge benefit for their seeking, because the seeking will then become about the end of suffering, which incidentally is what I say enlightenment and liberation, spiritual seeking is really about. And there's no doubt that as part of that seeking for the end of suffering, having the objective of truth at various stages is very important. It plays a wonderful role. But I do think that at some point we can replace it. We say, oh, that's good. Seeking for truth got me this far. And now maybe I need to question whether I can replace it with seeking happiness, which is really just the end of suffering, peace of mind. And if I replace it with something that essentially could be a a higher truth than seeking truth when we put it in this context and we say, actually, I'm just looking for the end of suffering. That's a higher truth than I'm looking for truth. Sorry, I think you were muted.
Yes, peace of mind, yes.
Yeah, that's what that. So the movement, I would say, in my experience and what I'm sharing, is it's the movement through all of these stages, even through the God realms, you can put it, right? So on the wheel of karma, in Buddhism, the birth and rebirth, they say it's not really about being reborn into even the God realms. That they are just levels, and so even the knowing oneself as awareness, if we look at the birth and rebirth wheel of karma as a metaphor that matches the seeking process, the knowing oneself as awareness can be the equivalent of getting stuck in the God realm. And so when, if we hear about the wheel of karma, and, there's the animal realm and the hell realm and the human realm and then the God realm, we might say, oh, it's about the God realm. Of course, that's what I want, the God realm. But when we really understand this wheel of karma, it's about transcending all of these realms. And in daily life, in practice, I would say that metaphor really means coming to see that there is no doer. And in the wheel of karma, no doer really means at the end of it, it's realizing there never has been anyone to be reborn. There never, and yet the wheel of birth and rebirth, the cycle of birth and rebirth, has kept happening for as long as the incarnation felt there was someone to be reborn. Then a rebirth happened. And so the end of that happens when we realize there never has been anyone to be born or reborn. And that, to me, in practice, is the realization, oh, there is no doer. I am not the doer. I am an expression of life, which is the end of separation, the end of the separate me. And that brings us back to knowing myself as the human being, not as awareness. So the realization of this formless awareness, which we think is and experience as the absolute, is the movement through which, or at which time, we are getting to know the consciousness aspect of the human being. And then that knowing oneself as awareness needs to make its way back into the body and be known as the consciousness that is actually functioning through the human being. That the consciousness that is functioning through the human being, which we've always known, is that same consciousness that we have an experience of in its expanded state. But that expanded state is not so that we live in the expanded state, but rather so we can become familiar with it, and then so it can be embodied, and then we can carry on living as the human being, knowing our essence in each moment, knowing that this that is looking through the human being is the same consciousness of source which we were pointed at or awakened to in that expanded impersonal state.
What would you say, what would your, in one sentence, how would a high consciousness evolved being live on Earth?
So how would high consciousness?
How would a high consciousness, self-aware, evolved being as a human being live on Earth?
Doing in each moment
So just Yeah, sorry.
They would, in each moment, do exactly what they think or feel to do, understanding that whatever it is they think or feel to do is God's will unfolding through the functioning of their own free will, which really means the doing exactly what they think or feel to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Seems like that's it for today. So thank you for joining me, and I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.